They were never unexciting, no. I mean, it's really hard to imagine Raymond Chandler or Dashiell Hammett with his detective ending up going up against the alien hordes with a battle axe, like Howard had Steve Harrison doing at the end of Lord of the Dead. But that was Howard. He loved writing adventure stuff, and so even the detective stories would turn into that. Biography of Howard is hard because of the element of, yes, he left a lot of letters that told something about himself, but Howard was a storyteller, and adherence to some sort of standard of objective truth was not really what he was after. For him, there was a higher truth, and that was the truth of the point he's trying to make. And so you always have to be careful reading his letters and reading his account of something that happened in his life. You have to be careful to look at, well, what's the context? What was he talking about? What's the subject? Is he telling this story to make a point or not? And if he is, you have to be careful and say, well, maybe he's exaggerating it to make that point more emphatically. You also have the difficulty of, even when you interview people, you'll get, Howard was different to different people, apparently. They saw him differently. His friend Lindsay Tyson or Dave Lee, who unfortunately was dead before people started looking into Howard's biography, but Lindsay Tyson was alive for a long time. Tevis Clyde Smith was alive. Harold Priest was alive. They were all people who actually directly knew him. But even they didn't always agree. Because Lindsay didn't know anything about Bob's literary life, really. He knew Bob wrote for magazines, but Lindsay didn't read his stories, and that's not what he and Bob talked about. They were cross-Plainsians, and they talked about boxing or something like that. Clyde was his literary friend. Novelyn Price was a girlfriend, but then they had a little falling out, but she was still a friend. But she's coming at it from the viewpoint of someone who is from another place coming into this small town, doesn't really have the background, so she sees him a little differently. She sees him as this potentially marriageable partner if only he could change a few little things. Then you talk to other people who, oh yeah, I saw Bob Howard. We used to see him going up and down the street doing crazy things. Well, you know, they were small, they were kids. So you get all these different conflicting kinds of pictures of Robert E. Howard. To me, Howard himself is a little bit like his stories are. One of the things that I've always said make his stories so compelling to so many readers is that he doesn't give you too much information. He lets you create the real visuals, the details. He gets on with the story, and he uses a broad brush enough approach that he can just say, he's running through the woods, and he lets you figure out what the woods look like. He doesn't over-describe them. But because of that, everybody puts themselves into a Howard story, and they have fierce disagreements sometimes about, they'll look at a drawing or a painting and they'll say, oh, that's not Conan. Oh, that's not Steve Costigan. Oh, that's not Hyboria. They'll say, oh no, that's not what I see it as. And I think Howard himself has a little bit of that, where this person saw him this way, and this person saw him this way, and this person saw him this way, and you're trying to connect those dots and wonder, well, you know, you can't always just say, well, the truth lies somewhere in the middle, because sometimes it does lean more to one side or another, and it's really a painstaking process to try to put together Howard biography. I think the truth doesn't always lie in the middle. It sometimes is closer to one end than the other. But when you've got 3 or 4 points, where's the middle? And you're just having to collate a lot of information from the letters, from the stories, from interviews and so forth to figure out, well, where do I think ultimately the objective truth lies? And I doubt that we'll ever have completely objective truth about Howard, because even as a biographer, you put yourself into your interpretation of those facts. There's people who think of Bob Howard as the doctor's crazy son and as the guy who wrote those weird, awful stories that, you know, I wouldn't want people to read and so forth. There's going to be some of that anywhere. But there's been a growing acceptance of Howard as or Howard Days and Howard fans as commercially, good for crossplanes. And also, in the years that we've been coming, we've made friends with people here, and good friends. Even if they don't read Robert E. Howard, they do like Robert E. Howard fans, and they appreciate that we come and that we have a good time and that we eat and buy things, and so it's good for the town. And we try to not, be too disruptive and recognize that it's their town and their rules. Oh, I think he definitely helped perpetuate the myth that he was a loner, kind of a guy who, nobody in, he didn't have anything going on in town, any friends in town and so forth. I think that was the pose of the misunderstood artist. He had good friends. Yeah, he was seen as Dr. Howard's crazy son to some extent because he did have some mannerisms. He did shadow box as he was walking up to the post office, working out stories in his head. I mean, so people look at that and they don't know that he's working out stories in his head, and so they think, oh, he's just crazy. He's dancing around shadow boxing. And what happens is that sort of thing tends to perpetuate itself because one person tells another person and they tell another person, and finally you've got people saying, oh yeah, he was Dr. Howard's crazy son, and they never knew him at all. One of the things that I've found is that as that somewhat older generation have been dying off or what have you, that the younger people coming along, they don't have that same misperception. They've been influenced to some extent by the fact that there's all these people who come and want to know about Robert E. Howard, to recognize that, well, maybe he was okay. But I think largely that pose of the loner, the one who walked alone, that was kind of a myth, I think, but Howard encouraged it. Writing is a solitary business. It's not something that you can do in company with others. Songwriters can. Songwriters frequently like to collaborate with each other and so forth, but fiction writers don't. They just sit in their rooms alone, working on the paper. Robert had to stay with his family because his father was so frequently out on calls. He was a country doctor. He was frequently away from home for days and days at a time. And Robert had to be around to take care of his mother, who was an invalid. So he couldn't really get away. So his mother took on the role of gatekeeper, not letting him be disturbed. So while he was working, nobody could get through to him. But when he was not working, he could go off fishing with his friends or go on a trip to San Antonio with his friends and go to football games or whatever. So partly I think he built up this idea of the loner to keep people from bothering him when he was writing. Well, I think his legacy is his work, obviously. A body of really fine adventure stories that speak to us of something about the human condition, maybe not something that I think this is, again, we were about his literary acceptance. That's one of the problems, is that part of his legacy is a view of the human condition that maybe we don't like to acknowledge, that there is violence at our very core. But that's his legacy, is he left us a body of fictional works that speak to that still speak to people many, many years, 2 generations after he died. But as with any artist, his art is his legacy. I've made really wonderful friends through Robert E. Howard. My friends in the Robert E. Howard United Press Association, my friends here in Cross Plains, friends involved in other Howard projects. I've made really wonderful friends through Robert E. Howard and Robert E. Howard fandom. I've gotten to be involved in some really dream jobs of editing Robert E. Howard books, getting his work restored to the condition in which he wrote it, not as posthumous editors would have it and so forth. I've gotten to travel some to nice places, keep getting to come back to Central Texas. And so to me personally, it's meant friendships, it's meant opportunities to feel like I've helped make a difference in Robert E. Howard's literary legacy, if you will. Well, besides the fact that I find a richness of themes and content that somebody like myself, who's sort of an analytical bent, who wants to know, what's behind that, and are there themes that you can see from story to story and so forth. That's fun to play with, but the thing that keeps getting you is I've edited Robert E. Howard books now for 10 years or something, and part of that process is you read the same story again and again and again, proofreading and making sure that everything's correct. And I still find myself caught up in the story and having to say, whoa, stop, come back, look at it as words, not stories. Because Howard's writing is just, it's so compact and yet so colorful, and he uses words really like a poet. So there are times where you're just reading through a story and you just say, whoa, what a really wonderful little gem of a phrase there. Wow. The thing that I've always said really gets me, the aspect of Robert E. Howard's work, I suppose, that really most appeals to me is that he usually grabs you within the first paragraph or two, sometimes the first sentence. I know there's an L. Borak story where he hears the chink of a stone that's just been kicked, and then somebody's trying to stab him with a knife, and he's grabbing the guy by the throat. And this is in the first sentence. He doesn't just sort of slowly lead into a story. He puts you right there real fast. And I've always said he grabs you by the throat and drags you into the story, and about 20 pages later he hurls you out. And you go, wow, what a ride. He is one of the fine adventure writers of all time. And it's condensed, it's compact, it's not 500 pages that you have to wade through to get the story. It's just there. And I think it's that economy of phrasing and the brilliance of his writing, the poetry of his fiction, if you will, that really gets to me. Well, presumably if he was still alive, I wouldn't have to ask him why in the world he did what he did. I would be interested, of course, because I've been so fascinated by his biography. I would love to ask him a lot of biographical questions. But I would love to talk to him about his work, too, and about the themes in it. I'd love to know how aware he was of the themes that he was writing about. I believe he was. From his letters, I think you get a glimpse that he was aware that there was something he was trying to say through these stories. As much as he would modestly say, oh, they're just pot boilers, I'm writing to make a living. I think he knew that he was writing about serious things, and I would love to discuss those with him, talk about history and his view of the cyclical nature of history. And the big mysteries for me as a biographer are, there's some missing years in Howard's life between, I'm trying to think now, between the ages of about 5 and 8. We don't know a lot about where the Howards were and what they were doing. So, of course, as a biographer, I'd be interested in filling in some of those blanks. I would love to know about his mother. We know almost nothing about his mother. People would talk about Dr. Howard. Dr. Howard was the extrovert. He was all over town. He was all over the county. He was out there. Everybody knew him. People named their children after him. Some people named their children after her, but very, very little is known about her. She seems to have been fairly reserved and didn't get out a lot. So I would love to know more about her and what kind of a person she was. I would say. Or it appears so. We don't, it's hard, you have to infer that, but it would appear so, that she and Bob, because Dr. Howard was out so much, that she and Robert, when he was very small, would necessarily be together a lot. And she read to him, she read poetry to him. So And his devotion to her would suggest that she was a huge influence on his life, but one about whom we know very little. I don't know. I don't know. It's hard to say because, again, we have very little in the way of direct information. We have some reminiscence from a woman who was one of the nurses for Mrs. Howard. It does seem that maybe there was a little bit of a please don't go, but she needed him. She was sickly. She was dying. Dr. Howard couldn't cease his practice and stay with her 24 hours a day, so Robert really had to take care of her quite a bit. So was that a bad influence? It's hard to say. It might have been nice if he could have gotten out and spread his wings. Then again, he might have been the type of personality that would have gone off to New York and killed himself in Greenwich Village in his 20s, so who knows?